So, Gege Akutami just dropped the greatest chapter of Jujutsu Kaisen. That might be short-lived since the stage has been set for the next few chapters to be just as good, but this was special. I got emotional reading the chapter leaks, which I don't think has ever happened before. This is the Yuji Itadori chapter. This is what everything surrounding his character has been working up to, and it is sad, beautiful, glorious, exciting, genius, and so much more. So like I did for chapter 261 a couple of months ago, this will be a unscripted review of the chapter, just discussing everything within it. Don't expect this to be as calculated or precise as my usual videos, because I'm just looking at my notes on one screen and the chapter on another screen while waffling into my mic. One unpopular thing I'll say right now, just to brainwash you into watching the rest of the video, is that I don't think Yuji has outgrown his role. I don't think he has completely moved past his cog mentality like so many people are saying. I don't think it's that simple, and we'll discuss what I mean by that shortly, or like towards the end of the video probably, because that's the main part. This video will probably be unlisted in a few weeks like I did for my previous JJK review, because I don't really like keeping them up on the channel. So if you're watching this, you're one of the chosen few. Give yourself a pat on the back. Done? Alright, let's dive right into this yap sesh. Both the chapter and my review, both of them consist of a lot of yapping. Chapter 265 is titled That Day, which was very funny to me because if you're a fan of AOT, you'll know that this pair of words is very important to that story. And after 264 released, I tweeted this, hoping that Gege rips off Isayama and gives us a chapter of Yuji and Sukuna walking through a bunch of different locations as they have a series-defining conversation. And Christmas came early because I got what I wished for. That is exactly what this chapter is. Series-defining conversation, the most important chapter of the story thus far. Everything JJK is about is laid out bare by our main protagonist. It's all thrown at the main antagonist and nothing really gets through to him. And it's precisely because nothing gets through to Sukuna and he so plainly disregards everything Yuji stands for that makes this the ultimate thematic clash of the story. It's not just humans versus curses or predetermined roles versus freedom. It's a clash between one who desperately tries to pass out the value in things, who tries to derive their own personal meanings from everything in their life, from the simple, impermanent mundanities of his childhood to even the monster who's made that life a living nightmare, versus one who engages with the very idea of meaning in a rigid, narrow box of what's literal, who takes everything at face value and only thinks about how those things can be used to his benefit. Everything in this chapter is in service of that clash of ideals. It is littered with metaphors that juxtapose Yuji and Sukuna, and the entire thing is a slow build up to a jaw-dropping, real fucking manga moment to finish it off. To make this easier for me, I've got the chapter open and we're gonna go through things chronologically from beginning to end. Alright, so last chapter ended with them appearing in a train station after Yuji popped his domain for the first time. This chapter starts with them going down an escalator in that train station. The author note is just as clueless as we are. Itadori expands his domain. Just what is this place? Alright, so Yuji states that he's experienced this before, the rare phenomenon of connecting with a sorcerer at the height of battle. I think he's talking about Todo and Choso here, the memories that never existed being born in their minds. This chapter makes it very likely that Yuji's curse technique does have something to do with memories, as people have theorized for years now. Sukuna being in the Yuji form but in a separate body does suggest that this is actually Yuji's domain expansion and not some kind of death vision like the ones we've seen for Kashimo and Jogo. A domain expansion is essentially the externalization or manifestation of someone's inner domain, a being's heart itself. The last time we saw Yuji's inner domain, he was still Sukuna's vessel, which is why the appearance of the domain took after Malevolent Shrine, Sukuna's domain expansion, which would make Yuji's hometown, or rather his memories of this hometown or whatever, his inner domain. The memories of his life before he became a sorcerer, before his grandfather died, home is where the heart is, that sort of thing. I also think this opens the door to the possibility that Sukuna gained the ability to converse with people in those death visions like we saw with Jogo and Kashimo from Yuji. If that's something connected to Yuji's curse technique and Sukuna essentially stole that from him by being contained within his soul in the same way Yuji gained access to Cleave by being Sukuna's vessel, it would bring those two characters even closer than they already are. Yuji also states states that he wanted some time to talk to Sukuna even though he doesn't really get what this realm is or if it's even his domain expansion, so there's more to this picture than what we know for now. Moving on, and we exit the train station, and this station is specifically Kitakami Station in the Iwate Prefecture, which I've actually talked about before in my merger video. Kitakami is not only Gege's hometown but a city in the same Iwate Prefecture where the 2chan urban legend that they were heavily inspired by took place. That's where the pair of Siamese twins that Yuji and Sukuna are clearly based on were from, and in this chapter we learn that Yuji was raised in Kitakami in the Iwate Prefecture just like Gege Akutami. And to top it off, Kitakami literally means heading north, which ties in with the previous greatest chapter of the series, 236, heading south. As a quick reminder, heading north is starting anew, heading south is returning to your old self. This is really important because while Kitakami literally means heading north, which as outlined by Nanami is starting anew, Yuji is literally walking Sukuna through his memories. The entire chapter is framed through a very nostalgic lens as Yuji ruminates on his past before becoming a sorcerer, so there's this sort of dichotomy present in the very premise of the chapter. Yuji is returning to his old self, going through his memories, which is quote unquote heading south, yet he's doing this in a town which is literally named heading north, aka starting anew. I think that's probably the main reason Gege wanted Sukuna in the Yuji form for this chapter, to hammer down how so many ideas explored here are twofold, and to remind us that Yuji's father shares the soul of Sukuna's twin brother whom he ate in the womb. Anyways, let's continue. Yuji talks about the moving back and forth between Sendai and Kitakami and how he returned for the first time in a decade for a funeral, friend of his grandfather's. He says it was surprising how empty the place felt, only to immediately go back on those words and say, actually I guess I wasn't so surprised. Kind of expected it and it didn't really shake me. It's clear that Yuji is not being completely honest with himself here, and the following pages practically confirm that. The place he spent his earliest years decaying over time and becoming a ghost town did shake him, but he's not lying about him having expected it. He then questions whether that guy would have come to his grandfather's funeral if he had died first, and this line sets the tone perfectly for what's to come. It's something utterly meaningless to question in the sense that it's not something that can ever be answered. That guy died before Yuji's grandpa and that's that, but asking questions of what could have been, asking questions you know you'll never have the answer to, is innately human in a way Sukuna cannot resonate with. We do not get a reaction from Sukuna here, but later stuff in the chapter puts him at odds with this mentality, and I mean just his character in general, even before this chapter. Yuji then takes him to a park he used to hang out at as a kid and talks about how it's pretty much empty, there's almost no play equipment left, it's become a ghost town, and yet because he had a semi-traumatic experience as a child stubbing his toe on the swing set, he's not too mad about the way this park has deteriorated over the years. The fact that he specifically says that he's not too mad about it though, that confirms that his words in the previous page about not being shaken by the way his hometown has decayed were dishonest, since he would be mad if he didn't have this bad memory of this place. He also has a terrible memory of using a water fountain to try and rinse off some slime he was playing with and actually dropping the whole thing down the drain. Yuji liked playing with slime like any normal kid. He liked doing meaningless shit because life isn't about maximizing every second of your day to being productive and doing quote unquote meaningful things. But we'll get to that part of the video soon enough. Yuji then sees a flower and mistakes it for a morning glory when it's actually a hydrangea. I think I said that right, which Sukuna corrects him on. But I don't think this is like a careless mistake as he said, but more so a way of Gege packing in some symbolism with what the morning glory represents, as well as a way to complement the general theme of meaning present throughout the chapter. Yuji says he noticed that a ton of these flowers bloom here after he moved away, and since this is a domain expansion and all of this is in Yuji's head, wouldn't it just manifest a morning glory if that was on his mind and that's what he remembered it being? How is he mistaking the flower that is just a projection of his soul? There's probably some symbolism in the two flowers that juxtapose Yuji and Sukuna, but I'm not about to Google flower symbolism. I only go that far for Bleach and Kubo. What's next is super interesting though, because Yuji questions Sukuna's knowledge of the flowers and Sukuna responds by saying it's just from Megumi's memories. But then Yuji also questions that, saying, wouldn't that mean like you know all about this place from my memories when you you were in my body. And then Sukuna responds by saying he doesn't waste his time reading through each piece of meaningless drivel, which to me is the most obvious deflection ever. I think his knowledge of flowers is just from his own life and not Megumi's memories, which wouldn't be too out of left field with his knowledge of haikus. I don't think he's ashamed or embarrassed or anything. I don't think that's why he's deflecting. Rather, he's deflecting because it's just an easy way out for Sukuna. It prevents him from having to talk to this guy to open up. It ends the conversation right there because he's clearly not having fun on this trip down Yuji's memory lane. The fact that he goes along with it though does suggest some curiosity on Sukuna's part. He's genuinely interested in what Yuji's point with all of this is, what he's getting at with telling Sukuna all this random shit about his past. And Yuji goes along with Sukuna's lies as well. The right is clearly Yuji noticing that Sukuna is chatting out of his ass. Oh, also calling the memories meaningless pieces of drivel, that's like the most obvious way Sukuna contrasts Yuji in this chapter. They then go fishing and Yuji catches a Japanese crayfish while Sukuna catches an American crayfish. Once again, very particular symbolism here. American crayfish are an invasive species which complements Sukuna's characterization as a parasite, which I spoke about in my Sukuna video, which I uploaded recently. And Japanese crayfish are a highly threatened species who are very rare, complementing how Yuji's outlook and humanity is so rare in the world of Jujutsu Kaisen. Also, Sukuna only being focused on the sizes of the fish is a very cool bit of cheeky characterization and reinforcement of his very simplistic outlook. The American crayfish is bigger, so it's better. Next up, Yuji takes Sukuna to a department store that opened up when he was 5, and this stuff is essentially a commentary on industrialization and commercialism, on how this big business popped up and all the smaller businesses started closing down. But they opened a movie theater, so even though this establishment played a large hand in the decay of this town, Yuji considered it even. It took from him, but it also gave him positive experiences with the movies. This is the opposite of how he felt about the park earlier on, where the provision of a negative experience with him stubbing his toe on the swing and losing the slime down the fucking fountain, that made him not care about how the park has decayed over the years. And this is also a metaphor that speaks to Sukuna. He's exactly the kind of person that sees nothing wrong with commercialism. He's a parasite who feeds off of other people, and everything about him is in service of himself, to maximize his own pleasure, to maximize his own jujutsu. Sukuna is basically a capitalist of cursed energy. They keep walking and Yuji comments on how grey the city is and how there's a lot more green once you leave the town a bit, and Sukuna is just growing impatient at this point. Yuji talks about how he used to catch grasshoppers in the fields, but he hasn't seen many lately, perhaps because pesticides got way stronger. Yet again, the deterioration of this town in full display as a result of human action. And once again, Sukuna is exactly the kind of person who'd use the strongest possible pesticides to maximize the farming process with zero regard for its effect on others. Next, they go to a farm, they do some archery, and Sukuna, being from the Heian era, is completely superior to Yuji, which, unlike the flower thing, he has no problem making clear because it doesn't give Yuji any more access to information about who Sukuna is beyond what he already knows. He's from the era of actual archery. I think I forgot to mention that they've been traveling through the 4 seasons and they arrive at winter, and this is where the chapter really begins to become something truly special for me. Yuji talks about snow sculptures, which is a fantastic example of something impermanent, something that has no long-standing value beyond the memories associated with the experience of sculpting it. The kind of thing Sukuna doesn't give a fuck about but means so much to Yuji. He then says it just doesn't feel like winter unless the snow really piles up. Once again, Yuji is expressing personal meaning, individual perspective. To Sukuna, winter is simply the coldest time of year. He can only understand and engage with it in its literal dictionary definition form, while Yuji finds value in things through his own personal takeaways, the quote-unquote feeling of winter. We get the cutest fucking panel ever of Kid Yuji drinking milk tea, and this is just there to show you how normal his upbringing was. Wasuke was just that normal parent he needed. Yuji may be biologically tied to 2 of the most heinous characters in the story in Kenjaku and Sukuna, but none of that has an impact on him as an individual. Even though that was his predetermined role, his fate to be tied to the King of Curses, he's just a regular schmegular kid with as normal an upbringing as any, besides the fact he's an orphan. In a way, Wasuke found a role himself in raising Yuji, and that ties into what's coming up next. But before that, Santa. This is one of the most beautiful little scenes in the entire manga for me, since this is like a universal experience for a lot of children across the world. I mean, I'm Muslim, so I never grew up celebrating Christmas or believing in Santa, but I had a similar thing with the Tooth Fairy where I wondered if they really existed as like a 6-year-old. And here's Yuji hearing bells at night, and that always made him think Santa really did exist. And what comes next is the most beautiful part to me, the realization later on that the sound of the bells was just the snow chains on car tires. But even though his belief in Santa was disproved, even though he no longer thinks Santa exists, these memories are still valuable to him. They're still things he's thinking back on all these years later and cherishes. That's what pisses off Sukuna and makes him finally interject. Sukuna's like, this fucking kid is talking about Santa even though he knows it doesn't exist? I've had enough. Why the fuck are you thinking and feeling for something you know isn't real? It isn't just blind faith or optimism, it's literally finding value in the make-believe and what that did for you, essentially. It's like if Yuji started talking about his favorite piece of fiction and how much that moved him, Sukuna would be pissed off. He doesn't get that shit. He doesn't speak the universal language of goat raw fire. He's not a peak fiction enjoyer. Santa is a metaphor for Yuji's outlook on humanity and the meaning of existence, essentially, just like every other little thing in this chapter. All of it coming from his own hazy memories of the past, which is what he considers meaningful. Memories, stuff that sticks in your head and proves you lived. Whereas Sukuna, on the other hand, his knowledge is precise but cold. He knew the name of that flower, but there's no personal investment there. He doesn't care for his memories because not only is he detached from humanity in general, but so many of his memories aren't even his. As a parasite who takes from the bodies he hijacks, he will forever hold Yuji and Megumi's memories in his head alongside his own, robbing him of that individuality. To echo the idea of impermanence throughout the chapter, the final season this chapter takes place in is spring, as they're surrounded by cherry blossoms. Sukuna has had enough and tells Yuji his blathering is disgusting. He's had enough of the yap sesh and just wants Yuji to get straight to the point. And get to the point is exactly what Yuji does. The following pages are some of the best in the entire series. Yuji essentially puts his perspective on living into words, his perspective on roles, his cog mentality, what it means for him to be a sorcerer. It's almost a chronological retelling and culmination of his journey and development, starting with his grandfather and his original misconception that his role was all there is to life. Yuji mistakenly believed that fulfilling his role was the only way his life would have any meaning, and also the only way he could have died a proper death, which is accompanied by Junpei, whose impact on Yuji only served to cement these beliefs. But now he feels like that's not entirely right. The wording here is crucial. He's not completely going back on his original belief, but there's a change in perspective. There's some positive growth here. It's a Nanami panel too, because Nanami's death doubles up with Higuruma as well. The death of the former, Nanami, is what caged Yuji to the self-destructive, senseless way he engaged with his role, and the death of the latter, Higuruma, is what reframed Nanami's death for him and is probably the exact moment he started reassessing his perspective on his own role. The up until recently he mentions at the start is likely just up until Higuruma was killed. I'd imagine that's when he properly began to question his worldview. I don't want to just repeat Yuji's words bar for bar here, but he really puts it very perfectly himself. But to put it simply, the following page is essentially Yuji's tribute to humanity. The mundane, the day-to-day, the shit you just do without even thinking about doing, the shit you need to do, like take a shit. That's what makes a person. That's what makes a human. The tiny little fragments of your legacy, the impact you leave on the world, whether you're conscious of it or not, that's where the value of a life lies. And those tiny little impacts you have on the world, that's what it's all about. The reason he detests Mahito and Sukuna is because they invalidate that. They act as if that value doesn't exist. They don't care about people's individual experiences. They don't care about life and the meaning of life as Yuji perceives it. All they care about is their own self-satisfaction, and in the case of Sukuna, how to use people. Which leads Yuji to say that humans aren't tools and we aren't born with any set role. So, why did I say that I don't think Yuji has completely moved past the cog mentality and his role at the start of the video? There's a bunch of reasons. Let me try and lay them all out. What is the cog mentality? What is the cog in a machine role that Yuji imposed upon himself back in Shibuya? The way I interpret it, it's the burden of being a sorcerer that Todo outlined in his speech. Yuji will do whatever he can to keep the machine that is his comrades and Jujutsu society running, and he'll never stop moving, specifically out of fear that he'll defile the lives of Nanami, Nobara, and everybody else. And this cog role manifested with the indiscriminate killing of curses, with Yuji succumbing to Mahito's way of doing things. But now, he's moved past that and the cog roll will manifest differently. I think it's very important that the machine of Jujutsu Society is very tiny now, and Yuji is basically the biggest cog. Most of the sorcerers are dead and he's probably the strongest, making him one of the ones who decides the Jujutsu status quo. The higher ups are dead, Gojo's dead, Yuta is at death's door. Instead of Yuji fully breaking free of his predetermined role, I think the biggest progression for his character in this chapter is that he's finally gained the recognition that there's more to life than just the role. He hasn't left the role behind by any means, but he isn't letting it define him any longer. I think Gege is aiming for a balance between Yuji being tied to his predetermined role and having agency within that to decide for himself how that plays out, like working within a specific framework but with his own autonomy. And the main reason I say this is because the final Yuji moment in this chapter is literally telling Sukuna to get back in his soul, which is bringing things back to Yuji's original role, Sukuna's vessel, the role he was literally created for. He was birthed into this world to serve that role, but instead of it being something he was kind of swept into and had been manipulated into by Kenjaku, it's something he's choosing for himself now. That's what Yuji means when he says we aren't born with any set role, that he's deciding things for himself. That's the main distinction in my opinion. Let me know your takes on that in the comments down below though. This is a very nuanced chapter, so there's probably a lot of stuff I'm gonna naturally forget to include, but I've been recording this for like an hour at this point and there's still so much more to say, so let's continue. This entire chapter up to this point is essentially Yuji's attempt to reach out to Sukuna and give him one final chance to feel something for others, a chance to be human. I don't think Yuji's offering forgiveness, but rather atonement. So much of this chapter is about Yuji deriving value from things that aren't real, or little experiences, or things that are impermanent, like how he let stubbing his toe on a swing set influence his thoughts on the park's decline, or the opposite with the movie theater providing him positive experiences that let him overlook the negative impacts of commercialism with the big industrial building, or how he came to learn Santa wasn't real but still cherishes the memories of when he believed he was, or playing with slime, which is like as meaningless as something could be but also perfectly emblematic of his humanity and innocence, or making snow sculptures. Not everything has to be meaningful in a result oriented way. Not everything in your life has to amount to something or be productive. The very process of living has value in and of itself. That's the Yuji Itadori take. Whereas with Sukuna, the deterioration of the town is a perfect metaphor for his outlook, for how destructive the way he thinks is. The pesticide, maximizing the farming process, why not? He has no regard for how it'll affect others if it serves his own interest and gives him the best results. The industrial building, why have several little mum and pop shops if you can have one big place that has it all? Sukuna is all about maximization, of pleasure, of cursed energy, of meaning and results. Yuji tries to reach out his hand, but Sukuna ultimately doesn't take it. No dice. In fact, Sukuna is so disappointed and dumbfounded by Yuji's antics, and then it clicks. He finally realizes the kid has been pitying him, and this is Yuji's way of showing compassion, with the compassion line being placed in a panel with a statue of Lady Kanon, the bodhisattva of compassion. Yuji confirms that pitying Sukuna is exactly what he was doing, and with one of his best expressions in the entire manga, he gives Sukuna an ultimatum. Come back to my body, release Megumi, and I'll spare your life. I can kill you right now. To which the King of Curses responds with pure vitriol and a face of fiery emotion, the likes of which we have never seen from Sukuna. This is probably my favorite panel of him in the entire manga. Being pitied is the most disrespectful and offensive thing he's ever experienced from his perspective, and I fucking love that. The chapter ends with a very specific threat. I will kill each and every human being you claim to be oh so valuable right in front of your very eyes. And based on the mere fact that Yuji even gave Sukuna a chance and was compassionate to this monster, that basically means all of humanity. Yuji considers every human valuable. And if you know me, you probably know what I'm about to say. It is merger season, baby. Shout out to the Kogane for pointing out how this is pretty blatantly foreshadowing the merger. In fact, this entire chapter is the perfect conceptual setup for the merger, since the very idea of the merger is that it robs humanity of individuality and the idea of personal meaning. Yuji in this chapter cherishes individual experience, and Sukuna threatens to slaughter everyone, essentially getting rid of that. Sukuna himself is basically a prototype for the merger in the sense that he's been merged with Yuji and Megumi. Yuji in this chapter uses memories as an expression of humanity, meaning and individuality, and Sukuna cannot resonate with that at all since his memories aren't even entirely his. Now imagine that being projected onto the entire human race and what that means thematically. It's happening, folks. Your resident #1 merger advocate is very fucking excited for the next few chapters, but even if that shit don't happen, I am so grateful for this fantastic chapter. I could yap about this for way longer, but I've said so much already. I can't believe this video is this long, and I'm dreading having to edit all of this. So I'm gonna cut it off there, but thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this video more than I'll enjoy editing it, which is an incredibly low bar because I'm feeling generous. Bye bye.